Around 5:30 p.m. on January 2, 2020, an emergency call was received by the dispatch center. The victim was located 15 minutes from Bismarck, on the grounds of a farmhouse surrounded by cornfields. The caller's name was Nikki Entzel. She stated that she had been unable to reach her husband for several days and wanted to check on him. However, the woman could not enter the house because it was shrouded in smoke. Nikki could not see what was happening inside the house but believed that her husband Chad was there. She was visibly desperate, her speech interrupted by sobs, and her words were fragmented and unclear. Finally, the woman demanded that paramedics, firefighters, and police officers be sent to save her husband. When the special operations officers arrived at the scene, they found that the fire had spread from the guest room on the first floor, where the man was supposed to be. The fire was quickly extinguished and the burned body of a 42-year-old man was discovered on the bed in the bedroom. He was completely naked on the bed, and a shotgun was lying on the bed. The position of the shotgun was entirely unnatural. It was far from his hands, as if a third person had placed the weapon there. Chad could not have shot himself in this manner and then repositioned the weapon. However, the police officers quickly determined that the man had shot himself in the face. There were no burns on the skin, as are typical with self-inflicted gunshot wounds. The shot was fired from a great distance. The fire source could have been a gas heater, a rather dangerous heating source that often causes fires. However, it is an easy-to-use and cost-effective heating method widely used in the USA. Numerous cigarette butts were also scattered around the house, but it was suspicious that they did not appear to have been smoked. It looked like they had been lit and thrown around, which seemed quite odd. When the police went down to the basement, they found another likely source of the fire. There was an oven downstairs whose top was heavily burned. It could have overheated during operation and been another starting point for the fire. There were too many contradictions and inconsistencies in the overall picture, prompting the police to immediately work on multiple versions of the events, as suicide seemed unlikely. The whole scene looked more like an amateur staging. Chad Entzel was born and raised in North Dakota. Immediately after high school, he went to college, where he studied engineering, mechanical engineering, and drawing. After completing his education, he moved to Bismarck, where he took a job as an engineer at a local company. All acquaintances and friends described him as a very simple, family-oriented, kind, and friendly man. Besides his work as an engineer, he was a baseball coach for a children's baseball team. On weekends, he coached young athletes and also hosted sports events. In his free time, he liked to go bowling with friends. Chad was always calm and balanced, clearly not the type to get into trouble voluntarily. The man was naturally cheerful and never let himself get discouraged. He hardly seemed like a victim of a psychological disorder that would voluntarily end his life. On April 6, 2015, Chad officially announced on his social media page that he was in a relationship with a woman named Nikki Entzel. Chad was 3 years older. Acquaintances described him as very happy at that time. Just a year later, in 2016, they got married. The woman had 2 teenage sons from a previous relationship. She worked as a shipping clerk in a food company and was described by her husband's friends and family as very self-confident. Her social media profile was filled with selfies of herself, with only 2 pictures of her sons among them. She was also a rather difficult and challenging person, as many of her angry comments about the behavior of salespeople made clear. She obviously had no problem taking her anger out on other people and constantly got into conflicts with various individuals. Many people simply avoided communicating with this person. In addition to her job at the shipping company, she also had her own small business, dealing with catering events and parties, particularly baking sweets. The woman was very successful in this field, as she posted a large number of attractive works on her social media pages. From the outside, the couple seemed to have a very successful relationship. The man was an employee of a large company and held a managerial position, while Nikki worked in 2 jobs, including her own business. The couple raised 2 children, and everything went smoothly until that fateful night when the woman called emergency services. This case was strange from the beginning. If the couple really lived together and raised children, why was Nikki not at home for several days as well as her sons? This question interested the police. and they began to question the immediate neighborhood of the couple. The man's acquaintances and colleagues confirmed that they had not seen him for several days. That was strange, as the man was a department head and could not neglect his duties. Chad was very responsible, and it was untypical for him to miss work shifts. At the very least, he would have called the superiors to inform them if he could not come to work for some reason. So they were immediately concerned. It turned out that the deceased man was last seen on December 30th, 2019. He was spotted on the surveillance cameras of the local bowling club. The 42-year-old Chad was seen on the next day, but he did not show up at work. His wife Nikki called the organization and reported that the man was very sick and needed a few days to recover. January 1st was a holiday, but the man was supposed to come to work on January 2nd. However, as he failed to show up again, his colleagues decided to call him at home to make sure the chief engineer was okay. None of them were able to contact Chad. The company's employees felt compelled to call the police, asking them to check if the department head was okay. The police officers responded to the request and stood at the front door of the missing person on January 2nd, 2020, around 1:20 p.m. They knocked on the door, but no one opened it. The officers walked around for a while, looked into the windows, but found nothing suspicious. The house was quiet. They did not conduct a thorough check and did not open the door of the house as they were not authorized to do so. The police assumed that the man was just sleeping off the New Year's celebrations. The patrol officers called back and said that Chad was not home, but there was nothing else they could do to help. They then simply left. Subsequently, the company's employees, convinced that something was wrong, contacted the missing man's wife. The woman said she was at work but promised to check on her husband after her shift. By 5:30 p.m., she reported to the emergency center, explaining that she could not get into the house because of the fire and smoke. At the crime scene, especially in the room where the victim's body was found, the forensic experts found clear signs of arson. The mattress was burned, and the source of the fire could have been a gas heater placed near the mattress. Cigarette butts and empty whiskey bottles were scattered all over the floor. What interested the police the most was why the man's wife and children were not at home at the time of the tragedy, and why they had not seen each other for days. The investigators summoned the woman for questioning to learn more about the incident. Nikki was very depressed about her husband's death. She immediately complained that her husband always smoked in the house and suggested that this could have caused the fire. The woman lamented that she was not at home at the time and could not save Chad. However, her statement was not credible to the investigators, as they believed that the man's death was not an accident, but a staged murder, leading them to further question the woman. Nikki explained her absence from the house by saying that the heating had broken down, forcing her to temporarily move to a hotel as she could not stand the cold. However, the children were not with her or her husband. They were living with the woman's mother at that time because she was overwhelmed with work. When she recounted the incident, she suddenly burst out that she had to take the children away because Chad was an abusive drinker. Until that point, she had never mentioned her husband's anger and had only spoken well of him. After making this statement, she later revealed that she and her children were constantly victims of moral pressure and physical abuse by the man. The woman had a large number of photos showing bruises and injuries inflicted by her husband. She confessed to the police that she had moved the children and left herself because she was preparing to flee from the tyrant to Texas. She had already secured a job at the new location where she would soon be. The move was supposed to take place in a week, but her plans changed due to her husband's death. Now she had no reason to leave and no one to run from, so she decided to stay. At this point, the investigators had nothing against Nikki and let her go, but continued the investigation, considering her a suspect. The day after questioning the wife, the autopsy results came back. The forensic experts found severe facial deformities caused by a shotgun blast, and the entire front half of the body was burned. The victim was lying on his back when the fire broke out, so the entire back half of the body was less burned, and the forensic experts found soot marks there. It is, of course, impossible to shoot oneself in the back with a shotgun. In any case, There are much simpler ways to take one's own life. The cause of death was a gunshot wound, and Chad was already dead at the time of the fire, as there was no soot in his airways. The chief forensic expert determined that the man had been dead for quite a while, 2 or 3 days, meaning he could not have started the fire. It became clear that this was not an accident. Someone had shot the man and then started the fire. In this context, the widow naturally became the main suspect as she had a serious motive. Additionally, the investigators quickly discovered another possible motive that might have driven the woman to the crime: the attempt to get rid of Chad Entzel. It turned out that shortly after the incident, she contacted the insurance company to claim compensation for the property damage caused by the fire. The investigators also discovered the circumstances leading up to the tragic events. In December, the family received the house and insured it, and less than a week later, it burned down under unexplained circumstances. According to Nikki, the relationship with her husband was in a severe crisis. Could a loving wife solve 2 problems at once in this way? Financial difficulties, and a husband who claimed equality with her. When the police investigated the crime scene, they found a package addressed to a man named Earl Howard. Naturally, this new figure in the case had to be checked. Quickly, his connection to Nikki was discovered. During their first questioning, she told the police that she had rented a hotel room, but upon checking, it turned out that the room was not registered to her, but to the man to whom the package was addressed. Earl Howard was an ordinary working man who spent all his free time at home. He originally came from Canada, but later moved to Bismarck, North Dakota, USA, due to an important job offer. 5 days after the fire, Nikki was brought in for questioning at the police station, where they began asking her leading questions about Earl. Initially, she denied knowing the man at all, but later unexpectedly admitted that she had a relationship with him. According to her, the two had an affair for a year, but her husband knew about it and accepted it. The woman continued to date her lover, as she had an open relationship with her husband. During this time, Chad started drinking more and getting drunk daily. Additionally, he frequently insulted his wife. During the questioning, the woman presented herself as a victim, crying constantly, yet continuing to tell her story, sometimes so quietly that the police had to ask her to speak louder. Experienced investigators believed that she was not sincere, but only trying to play the victim by shedding tears. She did not realize that the police had decided to play good cop and bad cop with her. In the initial phase of the interrogation, it was the good cop who stood by her side. When the bad cop came into play and pressured Nikki, she immediately changed her behavior and stopped crying. It was as if the woman realized that her tears would not have any effect, so she began to speak clearly and distinctly, without crying. After the investigator asked her to tell only the truth, the main suspect finally broke down and detailed the events leading to her husband's death on the night of December 30th. On the evening of December 30th, Chad visited his favorite bowling club, bowled for a few hours, and then went home. At this time, his wife was at the hotel with her lover. She planned to return home in the evening to pack her remaining belongings before leaving. However, when Nikki appeared at her front door, her husband was heavily intoxicated, began insulting her again, and physically attacked her. She said that in such moments she would just walk away. But at this point in the story, Nikki hesitated and began speculating on unrelated topics, complaining that her husband not only drank, but also lost money gambling. The bad cop had to pressure the suspect again to get her to answer the investigators' questions further. Unexpectedly, she confessed that she had not returned home alone that evening, but with her lover Earl. Her husband was visibly unhappy about this and started yelling at her, causing the woman to leave the house. According to the woman, Nikki heard a violent altercation and a scuffle between her lover and her husband, and then a shot was fired. However, she did not even ask Earl what had happened between the two when he left the house. Instead, the woman said they simply got into a car and drove off silently. The suspect wrote down her confession and placed it on the table. At that moment, she probably realized she might forget some details of the fabricated story, so she took the paper off the table and tried to tear it up. But the investigator was quick enough to snatch the confession from her hands. This behavior aroused even more suspicion. After the interrogation, the police officers had no doubt that the woman had something to do with Chad Entzel's death. The woman left the office in handcuffs. Later, while examining the crime scene, the investigators discovered a surveillance camera in the victim's home. This was a real stroke of luck for the investigators. The camera footage was seized and reviewed, revealing a lot of interesting things. The recordings show how Earl and Nikki arrived in front of the house on December 30th at around 10 p.m., about half an hour before Chad left the bowling alley. The woman and her lover went inside and stayed in the house for about 20 minutes. Then they came out with a stack of boxes, disproving the first part of the woman's confession. It turned out that she was already at the crime scene before her husband returned from the game. The investigators suspected that she had taken out belongings she wanted to save from the planned fire, which allowed her to at least be charged with premeditated arson. However, the entire picture had to be reconstructed, since such speculations were circumstantial evidence that might not be convincing to the jury. The couple then left the house, and Chad came home at 10:30 p.m., apparently not even realizing that his wife and her lover had been in his house. Shortly before 1 a.m., the car with Nikki and Earl pulled up in front of the house again. They entered the house, and then almost all the cameras went out. The only camera that still worked was the one filming the driveway. The view was limited and did not capture everything that was happening. Later, the couple left the house and drove away. The cigarettes found in the house were indeed the same ones the man had smoked, but they were not smoked to the end but set on fire and thrown onto the furniture and the floor where a fire could have started. This was obviously staged. Another incriminating factor was that Nikki was the sole beneficiary of the $26,000 insurance sum for the house. She was arrested on January 7th on charges of conspiracy to commit murder. After her arrest, bail was set at $500,000, but the woman did not have that much money, so she remained behind bars. It turned out that Nikki had already been convicted of fraud 3 times and was on probation at the time of her arrest. Investigators then went to Earl's house to arrest the accomplice of the criminal and get a statement from him. However, he was nowhere to be found as the man was on the run. Fortunately, the accomplice was not able to escape justice. 2 days after the woman's arrest, Earl was caught in Turin, Michigan. He was arrested at the border between this state and Canada, apparently trying to flee to his home country to escape U.S. jurisdiction. The man did not resist when he was arrested. After the arrest, the police were able to obtain further information from the suspect, enabling a more reliable reconstruction of the events of that fateful night. It turned out that the murderers had a much more important reason for the crime than the small insurance sum for the house. The accomplice's affair had lasted more than a year. During one of their meetings, the woman told her lover that the child had an insurance policy worth $600,000. They thought this money would solve their problems and give them the opportunity to live a carefree life. Nikki wanted to avoid all problems with the divorce and division of property, and therefore chose a darker and more profitable path for herself. They decided to kill the man and stage everything to look like a suicide. Next, the couple wanted to collect all possible funds from life and property insurance and flee to Texas forever. On December 9th, they made their decision and prepared the crime, which they carried out on the 30th. So that the children would not accidentally witness these events, Nikki sent them ahead to her mother. The woman knew her husband would go bowling that evening, so she came earlier and collected things she wanted to save from the fire. Video footage from the hotel showed the couple bringing the items to their room. Later that day, they returned to the crime scene. Nikki turned off the cameras and the security system. Earl had a shotgun with him. It remained unclear who exactly shot the victim, as the defendants tried to blame each other. What happened behind the closed doors of the house was impossible to find out. It was clear, however, that the murder happened while the man was sleeping. He was shot in the back and died instantly. Then he was turned over and shot in the face to stage a suicide. The perpetrators believed everything would go up in flames and the fire would destroy all traces, making their back shot impossible to detect by the forensic team. The weapon was carelessly thrown on the bed. Then the intruders poured out all the whiskey bottles they found in the house and threw them away to emphasize the man's drinking habits. They simply placed a gas oven in the room and set it on fire, expecting it to cause a fire, and left. The next day, they followed the news, hoping to hear something about the incident. But there was nothing. This only made them angrier, so they felt compelled to return to the house on January 2nd at 5 p.m. When the woman opened the door, the fire flared up immediately due to the draft. However, it was clear to her that the plan had not worked, as the house had not burned down to the ground as expected. Nikki called emergency services and realized it was impossible to eliminate all the evidence and traces she and her friend had left. She had to improvise to buy time to file insurance claims. During searches, investigators found fingerprints of both perpetrators as well as numerous DNA traces. The botched staging was immediately uncovered. Even the position of the shotgun on the bed revealed the attempt to mislead the investigation. If he had taken his own life, the shotgun could not have ended up in that position. This was one of the prosecution's arguments that convinced the jury. Nikki and Earl were charged with murder. At the last minute, the man agreed to a plea deal, allowing the prosecution to learn all the details of the crime. The 43-year-old Earl Howard pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit arson and tampering with evidence, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 21 years. During the trial, the defendants tried to blame each other, but Earl was more inclined to accuse the victim's wife. He testified against her. Nikki, however, refused to plead guilty and claimed she was outside the house when the shot was fired and that Earl had shot him. She also claimed it was her lover who set the fire, threw cigarettes, and staged a suicide. Earl was supposed to testify as a witness, but that did not happen. Later, Nikki was interrogated again. The woman told absurd stories that her husband knew about her affair and allowed them to meet, and that Earl and Chad were friends. Nikki claimed her husband was an alcoholic. However, no one in the family circle believed that the man drank heavily, beat his wife, and allowed her to go out with a lover. The husband was a department head with great responsibility, worked with children, and never gave any reason to doubt his qualities. He was never seen drunk and valued his family and work. Therefore, no one believed the defendant's story about a bad husband. Everyone thought she was making it up. Each successive story differed from the previous one. Nonetheless, the 41-year-old Nikki was found guilty on February 17, 2023, of conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and attempted cover-up of the crime. On March 16, 2023, she was sentenced to life imprisonment with parole after 36 years, plus 15 years for arson. This verdict was controversial because the sentence for the victim's wife was significantly harsher than for the lover. At the same time, there was every reason to believe that he was no less involved in the crime. However, this was justified by the fact that the lover admitted his guilt and cooperated with the investigation, while Nikki did not. The court's decision was not reviewed, meaning the first appeal of the criminal can be filed in 2026. Thanks for watching, and take care of yourselves.